Back in the golden age of Hollywood westerns, one name stood taller than almost any other: Roy Rogers, the man millions of children and their parents knew simply as the king of the cowboys. For an entire generation, growing up in the 1940s and 1950s, he wasn't just a movie star. He was a symbol of decency, courage, and old-fashioned goodness, riding across the silver screen on his golden horse, Trigger, teaching kids right from wrong long before anyone coined the term role model. But behind the white hat and the singing cowboy persona was a man who lived through more heartbreak than most of his fans ever knew. Now, decades after his passing, his own daughter has stepped forward to confirm the stories many people had only suspected, and the truth is even more moving than the rumors. Born Leonard Franklin Sly in Cincinnati, Ohio, in November of 1911, the future star had humble beginnings far removed from the glamour of California. His family struggled financially during his childhood, and music became one of his earliest escapes. When he eventually made his way west in the early 1930s, he wasn't chasing fame as a cowboy actor. He was chasing a career as a singer. He joined several small musical groups before helping to form what would become one of the most influential country western acts of the era, a band whose harmonies would later be recognized as foundational to the entire genre. It wasn't until the late 1930s that fate intervened. A well-known singing cowboy of the day found himself in a contract dispute with his studio, leaving a sudden opening for a new leading man. Leonard, determined not to miss his shot, tried to get into the audition and was turned away at the door. Rather than give up, he found another way in, blending in with a group of background performers until a producer recognized his face from his singing days and pulled him aside. That single moment of persistence changed the trajectory of his entire life. Soon after, he traded his birth name for something with more presence, choosing Roy as a nod to strength and Rogers in tribute to the beloved humorist Will Rogers, a personal hero of his. The rebranding was more than cosmetic. It marked the birth of an icon. Once he broke through, there was no looking back. He anchored Western films that dominated the box office for over a decade, becoming the top-grossing cowboy star in Hollywood for 12 consecutive years. His screen partnership with Trigger became the stuff of legend, with the two so tightly associated that many young fans genuinely believed the horse understood English. Rogers' merchandise empire rivaled that of Walt Disney, plastering his image on lunchboxes, toy guns, comic books, and clothing across the country. He once reflected that parents treated him like a built-in babysitter, dropping their kids off at the theater and picking them up hours later, happy, full of popcorn, and thoroughly entertained. It was a simple but telling description of just how deeply his wholesome image had embedded itself into American family life. But off-screen, Rogers' personal story was far more complicated than his squeaky clean image suggested. His first marriage brought both joy and devastating loss. He and his wife adopted a baby girl in the early 1940s, and shortly after, welcomed two biological children. Tragedy struck almost immediately, however, when his wife passed away due to complications shortly after giving birth to their second child. Rogers was left a widower in his early 30s, suddenly responsible for 3 young children, while still building his career in the public eye. It was during this painful period that his relationship with his co-star and eventual second wife deepened. Their courtship famously culminated in an unconventional and unforgettable proposal delivered on horseback in front of a live rodeo audience. The two married on New Year's Eve in 1947, forming a partnership that would define the next 5 decades of both of their lives, both on screen and off. Together, they would go on to build one of the most unusual and, in many ways, groundbreaking families in Hollywood history. In 1950, the couple welcomed a daughter of their own, born with Down syndrome, a condition that, at the time, carried enormous social stigma and was frequently met with medical advice urging parents to place such children into institutional care rather than raise them at home. Rogers refused. He was resolute in his decision to bring his daughter home, rejecting the prevailing attitudes of the era in favor of raising her within his family, surrounded by love. Sadly, she passed away just after her second birthday due to complications from an illness. Rogers' grief was profound, and his wife channeled her sorrow into writing a book about their daughter's brief life, a book that is often credited with helping shift public attitudes toward children with developmental disabilities during a period when such openness was rare. Rather than closing themselves off after this loss, the couple made an extraordinary choice. They opened their home again and again to children who needed one. Over the following years, they adopted several more children from vastly different backgrounds, creating a blended family unlike almost any other in the public eye at the time. One of their adopted sons had experienced abuse and abandonment before Rogers, moved by what he saw in the boy during a chance backstage meeting, decided to bring him into the family. Another daughter came to them from Scotland, discovered through her singing talent during a visit to a children's home, and would go on to become deeply close with Rogers, sharing his love of music and, later, his religious convictions. Still another daughter joined the family after being adopted from Korea in the mid-1950s. Not all of these stories ended happily. In the mid-1960s, tragedy touched the family twice within a short span. Their youngest adopted daughter died in a bus accident while on a church trip to deliver aid to an orphanage, just days after her 12th birthday. The following year, their adopted son, who had gone on to serve overseas, died unexpectedly while stationed in Germany. For a couple who had built so much of their identity around family, faith, and resilience, these losses tested them in ways that public image rarely let on. Despite everything, Rogers remained remarkably philosophical about hardship. He often said that without difficult times in life, it would be impossible to fully appreciate the good ones, a sentiment that seemed to guide him through both his professional decline and his personal grief. As westerns fell out of fashion and newer stars captured the public's attention, Rogers faced serious financial setbacks. He lost his long-standing studio contract, ventured into business on his own with mixed results, and was eventually forced to sell off valuable possessions to manage mounting expenses. Yet through it all, his faith remained a constant anchor, and he leaned heavily on his marriage and his large family for stability. One of the more human details to emerge from later interviews with his descendants involved his relationship with Hollywood itself. According to family members, studio executives once attempted to reshape his image to resemble more conventional leading men of the era, even trying to alter the shape of his eyes to look more like a famous contemporary actor. The backlash from fans was immediate, with letters pouring in asking why Roy's signature look had changed. The studio quietly abandoned the effort. In another anecdote, executives reportedly pushed him to build more visible muscle by performing repeated handstands, a request he apparently followed with characteristic obedience, walking from film set to film set on his hands. Perhaps most endearingly, when studio publicists urged him to mingle at glamorous Hollywood parties to raise his social profile, the notoriously shy star asked if he could simply bring a hunting friend instead, and reportedly spent the entire evening talking about hunting on a couch, uninterested in schmoozing with the era's biggest names. Rogers passed away in the summer of 1998 at his ranch in California, surrounded by his wife of over 50 years and members of his large family. In his final days, weakened by illness, he found comfort in prayer and quiet moments with loved ones. Before he died, he reportedly reconciled with one of his sons after years of estrangement rooted in personal and religious differences, a reunion that brought him visible peace in his last hours. His funeral drew mourners from across the entertainment industry, and tributes poured in from public figures who recognized not just his career, but the depth of his character. More than 2 decades later, it's his descendants who have kept his story alive in ways that go beyond nostalgia. Through interviews and personal reflections, his children and grandchildren have painted a fuller picture of a man who was far more complex than his cowboy image suggested. Someone who endured devastating personal loss, defied the social norms of his time to build a family through both biology and adoption, and remained privately humble even while publicly beloved. What emerges from these accounts isn't a scandal or shocking secret, but something arguably more powerful: confirmation that the values he portrayed on screen weren't just a performance. They were, by every account from those who knew him best, simply who he was. Fikai, yes surf naya paragraph high, 300 words. Joe AAP script mine insert ka seitain. I's family ku bad whale his say my not all of these stories ended happily sepil dale seitain. Beyond the losses and the hardships, those closest to the family often point to the quieter, everyday moments that revealed who Roy Rogers truly was behind the cameras. Neighbors near his ranch in California recalled him as a man who never lost his humility, despite being one of the most recognized faces in the country. He was known to personally greet fans who showed up unannounced at his property, taking time to sign autographs even during periods when his career was struggling financially. His children have described a household that ran on routine and discipline, but never at the expense of warmth. Meals were often loud, chaotic affairs with 9 children competing for attention, yet Rogers insisted on family dinners whenever his schedule allowed, treating them as sacred, non-negotiable time. Music remained a constant thread throughout his home life. Long after his film career had cooled, he would still pick up his guitar in the evenings, teaching chords to whichever child happened to be nearby and willing to learn. Several of his children have said these informal lessons were where they felt closest to him, away from the cameras and the pressures of his public persona. Faith, too, played a quiet but persistent role in daily life. Family members recall regular prayer before meals and a general sense that gratitude, more than ambition, shaped how Rogers approached each day, even during his leanest financial years. What comes through most clearly in these later reflections is not the image of a distant celebrity, but of a father who showed up, again and again, for children who came from wildly different circumstances. Whether biological or adopted, each child is described feeling equally claimed, equally loved, and equally shaped by a man who seemed determined to prove that family was something built through commitment, not circumstance.